The Landry estate lay several miles outside the nearest Louisiana town, far enough that the sounds of commerce, church bells, and passing trains never reached it. The property stretched across flat fields divided by narrow dirt paths and fence lines that looked older than most of the buildings. Though the early 1900s had brought changes to the state's laws and the outward structure of labor, the estate still functioned under rules that were spoken quietly and enforced firmly. People worked at dawn, reported to designated overseers, followed assigned tasks, and rarely questioned why things were done the way they were. It was understood, sometimes through words, sometimes through silence, that the past was not as distant here as outsiders might imagine. The household itself operated under a precise hierarchy. At the top were the Landrys, with Mrs. Evelyn Landry supervising the domestic side of the property and maintaining close ties to Senator Alastair Thorne. He visited frequently, his carriage or automobile rolling in without notice, accompanied by aides who moved with clipped purpose. Below them were the overseers, men who traveled the estate with keys, ledgers, and the unspoken license to enforce order. Beneath them were the house servants, tasked with maintaining the main building, preparing meals, and keeping the senator's rooms in impeccable shape when he arrived. Further down were the field workers, who lived in smaller buildings on the edges of the estate and followed routines that changed little from one year to the next. Everyday life followed a strict rhythm. Before sunrise, workers gathered behind the kitchen house to collect morning assignments. The child servant, known to most simply as the boy or the girl, depending on who spoke, because few asked and fewer cared about specifics, was always among the first to appear. The child's role was flexible, shifting from message delivery to supply runs to simple observation, which made them useful to both household staff and overseers. Moving quickly and quietly, the child carried instructions from one building to another, fetched items from storage rooms, escorted guests across the grounds, and stood ready in case someone needed a task done without attracting attention. The child rarely spoke unless necessary. Their eyes moved constantly, taking in small details and memorizing routes between rooms, stairwells, storage sheds, and the senator's preferred meeting spaces. Their posture suggested a desire to vanish into the background, but their attentiveness made them noticeable to those who studied others for a living. Some servants joked that the child saw too much. Others said nothing, choosing instead to warn the child quietly to mind their steps. Older women in the kitchen sometimes paused when the child entered, lowering their voices before resuming conversations about the senator's schedule, the overseer's temper, or the newest changes in the estate's routine. Hints of the child's past emerged only in small ways. A faded scar along the wrist revealed itself whenever a sleeve slid up during a task, thin, pale, and long-heeled, but unmistakably the result of punishment. No one spoke of it openly. Some assumed it came from a previous household before the child arrived. Others believed it came from this estate, though no one had seen it happen. Occasional flashes of memory surfaced for the child when certain sounds or tones of voice echoed familiar patterns. Adults arguing over ownership or property, a door slammed in anger, whispers about what the child might have seen. There were moments, brief, uninvited, when the child recalled crouching beneath a porch as two white landowners argued above, the boards vibrating under their boots. The memory ended abruptly each time, as if cut off before revealing something sharper. On this particular morning, the estate followed its usual order. Mrs. Landry conducted a review of the kitchen staff, reminding them that Senator Thorne might arrive within the week. Overseer Benton made rounds with his ledger tucked under one arm, his steps heavy on the wooden walkways. Benton was a tall, lean man with a habit of watching people a second too long before speaking. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. His presence tended to quiet conversations. Even the field workers straightened when they saw him approach. The child was sent from the main house to the storage building near the back of the property to retrieve a set of candle holders that Mrs. Landry claimed had been misplaced by careless hands. The task seemed simple, one of many errands the child completed without hesitation. The path to the building was familiar, winding past the servants' quarters and a narrow passage behind the smokehouse. The morning air held the lingering scent of wood and ash. Workers moved steadily across the yard, carrying tools, baskets, and bundles of cloth. Inside the storage building, dust coated every surface except the few items recently adjusted by staff. The child scanned the shelves, searching for the candle holders. Their hands moved objects aside with careful precision. Breaking something would mean punishment, even if unintentional. A loose floorboard near the back shifted underfoot, and the child instinctively stepped aside, noting the weakness for future reference. The candle holders were eventually located atop a wooden crate, wrapped in cloth to prevent tarnishing. As the child prepared to leave, a faint sound drifted from outside, voices, hushed and tense. The building's side door, rarely used, was slightly ajar. The child did not intend to linger, but their path to the main house required passing the door. A glance revealed two figures partially obscured by an oak tree, Senator Thorne and one of his aides, faces stern as they exchanged words the child could not fully hear. "Must be corrected before committee review," the aide said, clutching a folder. Thorne responded sharply, though his words were indistinct. His posture was rigid, the kind he adopted when displeased with progress. The aide opened the folder, revealing papers with names and dates, some crossed out, others overwritten. The child could not understand the content, only that the senator's hand moved quickly, gesturing to specific pages with irritation. The aide lowered his voice. The child leaned slightly forward, curious but cautious. Thorne placed a hand on the folder, closing it firmly. His eyes scanned the area, and for a brief second, the child felt sure he would look directly toward the storage building. Instead, he exhaled sharply, adjusted his jacket, and motioned for the aide to follow him toward the smaller office building attached to the west wing. The exchange lasted only moments, but something about it unsettled the child. It was not unusual for the senator to conduct private conversations on the estate. It was unusual for him to appear so early, without announcement, and to meet outside rather than in the controlled privacy of the main house. Carrying the candle holders, the child stepped out of the storage building carefully. Overseer Benton stood several yards away, leaning against a post, as if he had been waiting. His expression was difficult to read, but his eyes fixed on the child immediately. He pushed himself upright and approached with slow, measured steps. "You finished in there?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with something harder. The child nodded and held up the wrapped candle holders. "You were in the back a while," Benton continued, glancing toward the side door. "Nothing back there for you." It was not a direct accusation, but it carried meaning. Benton didn't wait for a response. He tapped his ledger with a finger, then stepped aside, allowing the child to pass. His gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Back inside the main house, Mrs. Landry accepted the candle holders with a nod that was neither grateful nor dismissive. She inspected them, noted a small smudge, and instructed the child to fetch a polishing cloth. As the child complied, the older kitchen workers exchanged glances. One of them, a small woman with tired eyes, pulled the child aside for a moment when Mrs. Landry was distracted. "Keep your head down today," she whispered. "Too many important folks around. Too many watching." The child nodded again, unsure whether she knew about the encounter outside or simply sensed the tension that accompanied Senator Thorne's unplanned visit. The staff's movements grew more controlled, their conversations shorter. The senator's presence altered the atmosphere of the estate, as though everyone had been reminded of invisible lines they dare not cross. Through the day, Tasks came rapidly: cleaning a hallway, delivering a message to a field supervisor, carrying a tray to the office near the west wing. The office door was closed tight when the child arrived. Voices leaked through the wood. Thorns restrained anger, the aide's attempt to pacify him. The child placed the tray on a side table and retreated before anyone opened the door. Rumors circulated quickly. A field worker claimed he had seen the senator rifling through documents as if something had gone missing. A house servant overheard Mrs. Landry instructing the kitchen to prepare meals for an unspecified number of guests later that evening. Overseer Benton patrolled more frequently than usual, pausing outside rooms he usually ignored. In the late afternoon, the child crossed paths with a young worker near the laundry shed. He was one of the few who spoke freely despite the risks, a habit that made others wary of standing too close when overseers were near. "You hear what they're saying?" he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Someone got too close to the senator's business. Happened before, too. Folks get moved off this estate for less." The child said nothing, uncertain whether the comment was meant as a warning or simply gossip. "Just be careful," he added. "You're always running around places most of us avoid. Don't let them think you listen too good." As evening approached, the estate quieted. The senator left as abruptly as he had arrived, his automobile kicking dust into the air as it rolled down the roadway. Benton watched from the steps until the vehicle disappeared, then turned back toward the house with a thoughtful frown. The child ended the day in the small servants' corridor adjacent to the kitchen, sweeping crumbs into a pan. The memory of Thorne's morning conversation clung to the edges of thought, not because it was fully understood, but because it felt out of place, like a door left slightly open in a room that should always remain closed. The warning glances, the tightened rules, Benton's pointed observation near the storage building, all of it pressed down with a weight the child could not name. By nightfall, the sense of unease had settled deeply enough that even the older staff grew quiet. One of them muttered softly while folding linens, "Children don't last long around secrets." She did not direct the words toward anyone in particular, but the child heard them clearly. As lamps were extinguished and workers retreated to their quarters, the child lay awake on a narrow cot in the small room shared with two other servants. The silence outside seemed heavier than usual. Every sound, the creak of old wood, the distant bark of a dog, the shuffle of feet in the hallway, felt sharper. Knowledge was dangerous, even small pieces of it. The child sensed this more clearly than ever before. The senator could not be questioned. Overseer Benton would not tolerate curiosity, and the estate itself seemed to shift subtly whenever secrets moved through its halls. For now, the child had seen only a glimpse of something unusual. Papers exchanged, dates altered, a conversation carried out away from watchful eyes. But the reaction of the adults, the tightened control, and the whispered warnings made one thing unmistakably clear. Something important had been uncovered, however accidental. And whatever it was, the child's proximity to it had not gone unnoticed. In the days following Senator Thorne's unannounced visit, the Landry estate shifted into a stricter and far more controlled environment, as if a silent signal had been sent from the main house and echoed outward through every building, hallway, and field. The routine that had once moved with predictable rhythm now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny. Overseer Benton made his rounds earlier than usual, stepping into spaces he rarely visited and observing workers with a rigid attention that suggested an unseen directive had been handed to him. The servants felt the change before they understood its cause. The child sensed it in the way people moved slightly faster, spoke more cautiously, and avoided lingering in areas where they might be noticed without purpose. Even the older workers, who had lived through numerous shifts in power and authority, seemed unsettled by the sudden tightening of control, adjusting their movements as if the air itself carried warnings. The estate had entered a state where every action, no matter how small, might be interpreted as suspicious if done at the wrong moment or in the wrong place. The consequences of the child's accidental proximity to the senator's private affairs were not immediate, but they accumulated through a series of subtle shifts. Tasks that once required little oversight were now assigned with explicit instructions regarding the path to take, the rooms to avoid, and the time expected for completion. The child's routes were monitored, not openly, but with the unmistakable feeling of eyes tracking each movement. When carrying messages between buildings, the child noticed Benton appearing unexpectedly around corners or standing at the end of corridors that had been empty moments earlier. He carried his ledger in the same way as always, but the frequency with which he opened it to mark something down had increased, suggesting he was documenting more than simple inventory or attendance. The household staff, aware of Benton's heightened vigilance, modified their behavior accordingly, keeping interactions brief and avoiding unnecessary contact with the child, as though proximity alone might draw unwanted attention. During this period, the child's internal awareness sharpened. The memory of the senator's tense exchange outside the storage building lingered, not in a dramatic or haunting way, but as a practical understanding that something had been glimpsed that should not have been. Without dialogue or confirmation, the estate itself communicated that certain subjects were not to be approached, and that curiosity, intentional or accidental, could alter a person's standing in invisible yet irreversible ways. The child did not fully comprehend the content of the documents or the implications of the senator's frustration, but the surrounding behavior of adults clarified that whatever had transpired was connected to a broader, more dangerous matter involving political pressure, personal power, and the maintenance of a carefully crafted public image. As days passed, new rules were implemented in a manner that suggested they had originated from Mrs. Landry, but carried the weight of Senator Thorne's expectations. Specific buildings were temporarily restricted, including the office wing where the senator often conducted private meetings. Doors that had once been left ajar were now locked at all times, and only select individuals were granted access. Workers assigned to those areas moved with heightened caution, aware that any mistake might be seen as a violation of newly established boundaries. The child, who had previously been called upon to deliver items to various sections of the estate, found assignments significantly narrowed, confined mostly to tasks within the main house or the outer areas where oversight was easier and less risk of accidental observation existed. This constriction of duties, while subtle, removed the freedom of movement the child had previously relied upon and forced a dependence on pathways that were openly monitored. The absence of direct confrontation made the tension more suffocating. No one accused the child of wrongdoing, and no punishment was delivered, yet the estate treated the child as a potential source of risk. Older workers adjusted their behavior subtly, reducing eye contact and limiting their interactions to strictly necessary exchanges. The sudden hesitancy from those who had once offered brief kindness indicated that they sensed the shift in oversight and understood the danger of being associated too closely with someone under scrutiny. The young worker who had previously spoken freely now approached his tasks with unusual restraint, no longer offering comments or warnings. His silence conveyed more than words would have, identifying the child as someone who might unintentionally attract consequences. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate regarding the senator's current political struggles. Though workers did not openly discuss matters beyond their control, whispered fragments suggested that committee discussions in Baton Rouge were approaching a decisive phase, and that the senator's status required careful management. Thorne's presence on the estate had always been tied to political activity, but the frequency of his visits, combined with his uncharacteristic impatience, indicated that something significant was at stake. The estate acted as both a private retreat and a site for discreet dealings, making it a natural location for whatever issue now threatened to destabilize the senator's position. The child's proximity to the wrong conversation could therefore represent a liability in ways not openly articulated. One afternoon, the child was sent to retrieve linens from an upper storage room of the main house. Normally, this task involved a simple climb up the narrow stairway, a quiet entry into the dust-heavy room, and a return trip with folded cloth. On this occasion, however, the child found items in disarray, as though someone had searched hastily through stacks of old records and household items. Boxes were half open, and loose papers lay scattered across a wooden trunk. Some bore official stamps, though their content was unreadable from a distance. The disorder suggested that someone had looked for specific documents, perhaps connected to the senator's earlier frustration. The child did not linger, recognizing that the presence in this room, even for legitimate tasks, could be misconstrued. The linens were gathered quickly, and the child exited, taking note of the unusual disruption without drawing conclusions. Later that evening, the estate endured an uncharacteristic turnover. 2 workers were dismissed without ceremony, instructed to leave before nightfall. Their removal was handled quietly, with minimal explanation, consistent with the estate's preference for avoiding open conflict. The reason behind their dismissal was not explicitly stated, but the timing, following the senator's visit and the tightening of household rules, implied a connection. Workers on the estate understood that dismissals often occurred when someone became inconvenient or when a rumor, even if unsubstantiated, suggested proximity to sensitive information. The child watched their departure with a mix of caution and comprehension, recognizing the pattern without being able to articulate its structure. As pressure mounted, the child faced a small but significant decision that revealed deeper motivations. During one of the increasingly strict inspections orchestrated by Overseer Benton, an older servant accidentally dropped a kitchen tool, producing a clatter that attracted unwanted attention. Benton demanded an explanation, and though the incident was minor, the tension in the moment indicated that any misstep might trigger harsher consequences under the estate's current climate. The child, having witnessed the moment, stepped forward and accepted responsibility for placing the object improperly earlier in the day, despite having had no involvement. The action was instinctive, shaped by an understanding that the older worker could face disproportionate repercussions. Benton recorded the mistake in his ledger without comment, marking the child's record with a quiet stroke of ink. This decision, though seemingly small, represented an irreversible shift. The child chose to protect another at personal cost, demonstrating a motivation rooted not in rebellion, but in a quiet sense of responsibility that would later carry greater weight as events unfolded. This choice had consequences. Benton's attention intensified further, and the child was assigned additional duties that allowed for closer supervision. Tasks became heavier and more repetitive, designed to occupy time and limit movement between buildings. The estate seemed to close in physically as pathways narrowed and access points diminished. Psychological pressure followed, with an unspoken message that the child's behavior would be monitored for deviations or signs of disloyalty. Workers around the estate interpreted this shift and responded by maintaining distance, ensuring that no one could be accused of forming alliances or spreading information. The tension among secondary characters became increasingly visible despite the absence of open confrontation. The older women in the kitchen exchanged brief, uneasy glances when the child entered, revealing concern without suggesting direct involvement. Benton's expression hardened whenever the child passed through shared spaces, his posture stiffening with a mix of suspicion and readiness. Mrs. Landry maintained a controlled composure, but her movements grew sharper, and she issued instructions with the precision of someone ensuring that no detail escaped her oversight. The young worker who once risked small talk now approached his duties with mechanical efficiency, avoiding eye contact entirely. These fractures in interpersonal dynamics reflected the broader atmosphere of unease. Alliances were weakening, caution was overtaking conversation, and the estate's hierarchy was tightening in response to pressures unseen by most but felt by all. As the days progressed, the child became aware of another shift, an increase in silent surveillance. Moving between the laundry area, the servants' corridor, and the main house, the child sensed people watching through partially open doors or from the edges of rooms. These observations were not overt, but persistent enough to create a sense of confinement. The estate, in effect, was narrowing around the child, forcing a confrontation not through violence or explicit accusation, but through the gradual collapse of freedom and trust. The child's isolated status grew more pronounced with each passing day, reinforcing the understanding that knowledge, even accidental, carried consequences that did not require explanation to be effective. By the end of the week, the child had reached a point where the conflict could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or temporary unrest. The pattern of changes, restricted access, increased surveillance, sudden dismissals, heightened tension, and escalating scrutiny, formed a coherent narrative of danger that did not need to be spoken aloud. The child's position had shifted from unnoticed utility to potential liability, not through action but through proximity to something the estate considered fragile and protected. The pressing question was no longer what the documents contained or why the senator had reacted so sharply, but how long the estate would tolerate the presence of someone who had, even unintentionally, brushed against its most guarded secret. This realization marked the transition into irreversible territory. The child could no longer remain neutral, because neutrality was neither possible nor recognized within a system where silence itself could be interpreted as knowledge. The first spark of conflict, once a small and nearly forgettable moment, had expanded through layers of cause and effect, becoming a force that reshaped the estate's social order and redefined the child's place within it. The road ahead promised greater danger, because the estate had already begun shifting its weight toward a confrontation that could not be avoided. The first signs that Senator Thorne had shifted from suspicion to deliberate action appeared gradually, though not quietly. The estate's atmosphere changed from its usual harsh rigidity into something sharpened, as though invisible wires had been strung from doorway to doorway, catching even the smallest misstep. The senator had arrived before sunrise without the customary entourage. Instead, a pair of unfamiliar men walked with him, moving across the yard with the heavy purpose of those accustomed to searching for things others preferred to remain buried. Benton trailed them with a stiffness that betrayed his discomfort, for it was clear that the unspoken investigation Thorne demanded was not a matter of discipline but discretion, and discretion was a realm Benton understood only in pieces. The workers felt the shift immediately. The older women moved more slowly, not from laziness but from a careful attention to their surroundings, as if the walls themselves might betray an overheard whisper. The younger ones kept their eyes lowered for longer, and when they passed one another, they did so without exchanging the subtle glances that had once served as their quiet language. For the child, the change took on a more pointed shape. Benton's errands grew longer, demanding visits to storage sheds on the far end of the fields or repeated inventory checks of rooms already inspected that morning. These tasks were excuses, thinly concealed attempts to keep the child isolated and visible at the same time. The overseer seemed to place the child in spots where Thorne's men could cross paths with them, as if observing whether fear would produce some involuntary confession. Mealtimes, already sparse, were cut further, and the short moments where the child could drift unnoticed among the workers began to disappear. The estate became an intricate map of places the child was allowed and places that were suddenly forbidden, though the boundaries changed by the hour, as if someone were drawing new lines on a board whenever the child managed to adapt. Outside the estate, a different pressure was growing. It could be sensed only through snatches of overheard movement. The arrival of envelopes carried urgently, the tense pacing of Thorne's aides, the way the senator disappeared into closed rooms for hours and emerged with a posture wound tighter than before. Something in the Capitol was shifting. A vote, perhaps, or the threat of a scandal that could topple reputations built over decades. Whatever it was, it deepened the edge of desperation that now clung to every action Thorne undertook. His need for silence grew ravenous, and the more desperate he became, the more dangerously his attention narrowed toward the weakest link in his controlled environment, the small servant he believed had seen more than they should have. Among the staff, true loyalties began to reveal themselves under the pressure. One servant who had always maintained a neutral distance, neither kind nor cruel, suddenly watched the child a little too closely. She moved through the estate with an alertness that suggested she had been told to observe, not merely to work. Her slight nods to Benton, barely noticeable unless one searched for them, confirmed she had chosen caution over compassion. Yet just as betrayal took root in some hearts, unexpected bravery surfaced in others. An elder worker, stooped, slow, and long accustomed to the estate's quiet cruelties, briefly shielded the child by ushering them toward an unused canning shed when Thorne's investigators circled too near. Her actions were subtle but unmistakably deliberate, the kind of risk taken by someone who already knew the cost of being discovered, yet found fear less convincing than conscience. Mrs. Landry, meanwhile, stood fully and openly aligned with the senator's cause. She moved through the estate with a cold determination that left no room for gentleness. Every gesture she made seemed to affirm a single belief, that the senator's safety, reputation, and influence mattered more than the comfort or security of those laboring beneath her. Her presence was both shield and weapon for Thorne. She reinforced his authority while ensuring the workers understood that any attempt at defiance would be met with swift consequences. Under her oversight, whispers died before they were born, and subtle acts of resistance dissolved beneath the heavy pressure she cast over the estate. What pushed the child from reluctant awareness into decisive action was not a sudden burst of courage, but the creeping realization that inaction no longer protected anyone. Thorne's men returned repeatedly to one particular building, a storage house used in past seasons to keep agricultural records and crates of supplies. Something inside had caught their interest, something they believed someone had tampered with. The child, already familiar with the estate's hidden corners, noticed that the men always checked the lower cabinets, but never looked higher, where a narrow crawl space opened near the rafters. Driven by instinct rather than strategy, the child returned there alone one cloud-thick morning, climbing silently into the loft when Benton's attention veered elsewhere. Among thick dust and the faint smell of dried grain, the child found what the men had missed, a bundle of bound papers hidden inside an old crate, wrapped in cloth to disguise their importance. Inside were dated records, some with numbers that had been altered, others with notes written in a hurried hand. A handful of sealed letters lay tucked beside them, their contents unknown but their significance unmistakable. These documents, though the child could not decipher every detail, were clearly tied to the senator's dealings, financial, political, perhaps legal. Hatred, fear, or anger did not drive the child to take them. Only a sense of inevitability, a recognition that the evidence would not remain hidden forever and that those searching for it would destroy whatever, or whoever, stood in their way. Retrieving the documents was not a choice. It was a moment in which the child simply became aware that the choice had already been made by forces larger than them. The act carried weight beyond its immediate danger. Once taken, the papers could not be returned without suspicion, and if they were discovered missing, blame would fall upon the most vulnerable figure on the estate. The child felt the shift as soon as the bundle was wrapped beneath their clothing. A heaviness, not only physical but moral, an understanding that the contents could topple Thorne but also endanger everyone living under the estate's oppressive order. The evidence became both shield and threat, a burden the child did not ask for but could not abandon. The estate responded swiftly to the tightening tension. One of the younger workers, barely older than the child, known for occasional whispered conversations during rare moments of calm, vanished without explanation. His absence spread through the estate like a cold wind. No one claimed to know why he was gone, but those who understood the patterns of power recognized the warning embedded in his disappearance. Not long after, another worker suffered a punishment not to the point of injury described in detail, but harsh enough that the message was unmistakable. The child saw the aftermath from a distance. A figure moving slowly, rigidly, bearing the marks of an ordeal meant to intimidate others rather than correct an actual wrongdoing. In that moment, the child understood that Thorne was no longer searching for information. He was hunting for fear, extracting it from the workforce to ensure absolute silence. The estate's mood collapsed into dread. Conversation ceased entirely except when work demanded it. Footsteps softened. Even the natural sounds, birds, insects, the rustling wind, seemed muted, as if the land itself recoiled. The workers moved like people trapped within a story being written by a hand that cared nothing for their survival. And in the center of that tightening circle stood the child, aware that the senator's secret had become a living thing, pushing outward from its hidden corners and threatening to swallow anyone who stepped too near. The moral question that had hovered since the first moment the child glimpsed Thorne's hidden dealings now grew heavier, no longer abstract or distant. Exposing the senator could free the workers from a figure whose power reached into every corner of their lives. But doing so could ruin many of them before the truth ever reached the outside world. The documents represented a path toward justice. Yet justice carried teeth sharp enough to wound those who had never chosen to be part of this conflict. The child felt the pressure of that understanding each time they touched the hidden papers, knowing that silence preserved their own safety but condemned others to continued suffering, while action could destroy both Thorne and innocent lives caught in the fallout. The decision no longer belonged to a child, though a child was the one forced to make it. The question pressed against them like a pulse: remain silent and survive, or act and risk the fragile community that had offered rare moments of care within the estate's brutal hierarchy. As the estate's fear deepened and Thorne's desperation grew sharper, it became clear that the child stood at the thin boundary between two possible futures, neither safe, neither simple, both demanding a cost that could not be undone. The night the senator returned, the estate felt as if the land itself had been woken abruptly and forced into stillness. Heavy winds pushed against the house with the slow insistence of a creature trying to enter, while the distant fields seemed to flatten under the weight of air thick with approaching crisis. The workers sensed it before the first carriage lantern appeared through the trees. They moved quietly, finishing tasks early, exchanging looks that held neither hope nor prediction, only the grim recognition that something long building had finally reached its chosen hour. Senator Thorne arrived without warning, accompanied not by his usual entourage, but by a cluster of political aides whose movements were far too brisk, far too precise, revealing the urgency beneath their polished exterior. They dispersed immediately upon reaching the estate, some toward the main house, others toward the outer buildings, as if they had rehearsed this arrival and each step was part of a plan already finalized. Thorne himself walked ahead of them with the posture of a man who believed he owned the night. His coat blew open against the wind, revealing the rigid set of his shoulders and the barely contained tension that had been growing with each passing day of uncertainty. Mrs. Landry appeared on the porch before he even reached the steps, her expression shaped into cold determination. She wasted no time directing the aides, pointing toward rooms where records were kept, spaces where staff could be questioned, corners of the estate she believed needed to be purged of hidden threats. Her words were low but edged with unmistakable urgency, and the aides responded with immediate compliance. To her, the estate was not a home or a business. It was a structure of reputation, a vessel of influence, and she would not allow it to fracture under the pressure of rumor or truth. Behind them, Benton emerged with a lantern swinging heavily from his hand. He walked toward the workers' quarters with that same grim certainty he displayed whenever discipline was required. Except tonight it was not discipline he pursued but information. The lantern's glow formed a stark circle around him as he gathered the workers into a tight group inside the dim yard. His voice carried only commands: move, stand, wait, each delivered with a quiet intensity that replaced the usual bark of orders. The workers understood that what was coming was not routine questioning but a narrowing search, a hunt for a single thread threatening to unravel the senator's carefully woven power. The child felt the shift from a hiding spot just beyond the workshops, where shadows layered thickly and the air carried the scent of old wood and cooling earth. The documents hidden beneath their clothing felt heavier tonight, as though the truth they contained had developed its own gravity, pulling events toward it with inevitability. They watched as Benton's questions grew sharper, his gaze scanning each face with impatience, noting every hesitation. The workers, already drained by days of fear, complied while trying to avoid drawing attention, though some couldn't help glancing toward the darker edges of the yard where the child sometimes lingered. Those glances, subtle as they were, carried weight. They were not indications of guilt, but of worry, small signs of human connection that might be reinterpreted by someone desperate for control. As questioning spread across the estate, the child slipped away from the line of lantern light, moving into the strips of shadow between the outer buildings. They kept to the familiar edges, using memory of the estate's layout as a guide through a night charged with danger. Every sight sharpened, every sound rang too clearly. The rustle of aides searching through storage rooms, the low murmur of Mrs. Landry issuing directives, the uneven pacing of Thorne himself as he moved from one section of the estate to another. He walked as if trying to outrun the consequences converging upon him, yet also determined to crush the threat before it reached daylight. The child knew that the senator's desperation would eventually lead him to the truth lodged somewhere within his own property. And since he could not yet see the truth, he would focus on removing anyone who might be connected to it. The workers were no longer simply laborers. They were potential obstacles, potential witnesses, potential risks. Every person on the estate had become, in Thorne's eyes, a problem to be sorted into categories: useful, loyal, expendable. The child, unknowingly carrying the evidence he feared most, was the unknown variable he could not tolerate. As the night deepened, the storm that had lingered at the horizon began moving closer, its low rumble vibrating across the distant fields. The wind picked up, batting open shutters and driving dust across the yard. Thorne and Mrs. Landry regrouped inside the main house, where a room had been prepared for the senator's restricted use. It was a space usually reserved for meetings with political allies, but tonight it had become something more like an interrogation chamber, its windows shuttered, its lamps turned low, its corners cast in calculated obscurity. Papers lay spread across the large table in the center, some brought by aides, others unearthed from the estate's own storage. Thorne circled the table repeatedly, each turn more tense than the last, his mind clearly trying to piece together a story that remained just out of reach. It was during this frantic search that betrayal finally revealed itself. One of the servants, the same one who had watched the child too closely in recent days, approached Benton and whispered something that caused him to stiffen. Benton immediately signaled two aides, and together they moved with swift purpose toward the outer buildings. The child saw them coming, but did not at first understand why their movements felt so precise. Only when they entered the narrow passage between the smokehouse and the old canning shed did the truth settle. Someone had revealed the child's hiding places. With nowhere left to run without being exposed, the child retreated farther into the estate's shadowed outskirts, but the search tightened relentlessly. Lanterns swept across fenced paths and between tool sheds, their beams slicing through the darkness and illuminating spaces where the child had once moved unseen. Footsteps echoed with purpose, and each time they passed, the child felt the pressure of being hunted, the awareness that the estate's protective familiarity had dissolved into a maze turned against them. Eventually, the aides cornered the child near the back entrance of the main house, where the yard narrowed into a tight corridor bordered by stacked crates. They closed off the exit with steady movements, leaving the child no path except the one that led directly into Thorne's territory. Benton appeared behind them, gesturing for the child to be brought into the house. His expression was unreadable, yet his posture held a triumphant rigidity that suggested he believed the situation was finally under control. Inside the restricted room, the atmosphere carried a heavy, suffocating weight. The lamps cast a strange, wavering glow across the table where papers lay scattered like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Thorne stood at the far end of the room, his eyes fixed on the child with a scrutiny that felt colder than anger. He studied the child's posture, their clothing, their expressions, searching for signs that would confirm his suspicions. Mrs. Landry stood rigidly near the door, her focus sharpened into something severe, as though she had already judged the child guilty of whatever the senator feared. The confrontation began without a word spoken aloud, but through action and presence. Thorne approached slowly, examining the child with an air of clinical detachment. He reached for items of clothing, patting lightly, searching pockets, expecting to find the evidence that haunted him. The child stood motionless, aware that any resistance would escalate the moment into something irreversible. Thorne's hands moved with increasing impatience, then frustration, as he found nothing. It was only when he stepped back and gestured sharply toward Benton that the overseer moved forward, his intent unmistakable, to push the child into confession through intimidation alone. But the child had reached a point beyond passive fear. When Benton's movement brought the moment to its breaking point, the child shifted, revealing the documents they had hidden for days. The gesture was neither triumphant nor defiant. It was the simple act of someone who understood that secrets, once carried long enough, became impossible to keep buried. The papers emerged like a physical manifestation of everything unspoken, and the reaction in the room was immediate. Mrs. Landry stiffened as if struck by a sudden, chilling realization. Thorne stopped moving entirely, his face draining of the confidence he had worn like armor. The aides halted their pacing. Benton stared with a mixture of disbelief and rising alarm. The papers lay in the child's hands like a verdict, weightless yet heavier than any weapon the room could have held. Thorne stepped forward with a controlled urgency, reaching for the documents, but the child instinctively stepped back. The movement was small but powerful enough to shatter the fragile illusion of control he had maintained. Thorne's composure cracked, revealing fear beneath his authority. He signaled sharply to the aides, who closed in, creating a ring around the child. Actions overtook hesitation. The papers were seized, but the act of grabbing them did not erase what had been revealed. It only confirmed the senator's desperation. The consequences unfolded quickly. One of the aides, clearly more pragmatic than loyal, scanned the top sheet and froze. The contents were simple but devastating. Misappropriated funds, false reports, signatures traced rather than signed, all linked to a public works project that had failed disastrously months earlier, costing lives in communities far from the estate. The aide's expression tightened, not out of sympathy for the victims, but because he understood the political catastrophe hidden in those pages. The room fractured into chaos. Mrs. Landry lashed out at the nearest aide, demanding that the documents be destroyed before dawn. Another aide insisted they needed to contain the matter by controlling the workers. Benton argued that the child had not acted alone and that more threats might be hiding. Thorne, caught between conflicting strategies, paced in tight, frantic circles, his breathing unsteady. In the midst of this turmoil, someone had to pay. The system Thorne built thrived on sacrifice, and he chose the nearest target. A trusted worker, one who had once shown kindness to the child, was pulled into the room by two aides, accused of assisting in hiding the documents. The punishment delivered was not described in gruesome detail, but its weight echoed through the walls, and its intent was clear: to remind everyone that truth was dangerous, and that silence was safer even in moments when silence felt unbearable. The uproar grew too loud to contain. A servant outside heard a crash. Another heard raised voices, and soon the estate was filled with whispers that no longer stayed quiet. The confrontation had broken the internal order. Aides moved with frantic urgency, trying to suppress growing rumors. Mrs. Landry fought to regain control of the house. Thorne demanded the destruction of the papers, but the aide who had read them hesitated, not out of morality, but because he recognized the potential leverage they held. In the midst of this chaos, the child saw a narrow, unexpected opening. As the aides argued, the senator spiraled, and Mrs. Landry directed her fury elsewhere. The child slipped back through the door and into the hallway. They moved with a clarity that had not existed before, guided by the understanding that the estate was no longer a place of waiting, but a place of action. Each step carried the momentum of someone who had crossed the boundary between survival and purpose. The confrontation had revealed the truth, but the consequences were still unfolding. Someone had been harmed. The senator's image had begun to crack, and the estate no longer operated under the rigid illusion of order. The child's fate now hung between escape and capture, between being hunted or being the catalyst for a chain reaction that could finally expose everything Thorne had hidden. The next decision they made would not only determine their future, but the future of everyone trapped within the senator's tightening grasp. In the days that followed the confrontation, the estate entered a period of unnatural stillness, as if the land itself had absorbed the shock of what transpired and now struggled to return to any rhythm resembling normal life. Workers moved more quietly than before, not out of obedience, but because silence had become the only tool left for self-preservation in a place where the rules had been rewritten overnight. The storm that had threatened the night of the senator's arrival had long passed, yet something heavier than bad weather lingered. It settled over the fields, seeped into the walls of the main house, and clung to the routines of daily labor. Everyone could feel it, the difference between old fear and new fear, the shift from predictable oppression to something more unstable and unpredictable. The estate's population changed quickly. Some workers disappeared within a day or two, removed without explanation or quietly sent away to relatives, boarding houses, or neighboring farms. Others stayed but withdrew inward, avoiding eye contact, refusing to linger near each other, completing tasks with mechanical precision so as not to invite scrutiny. Overseer Benton patrolled longer hours. Though his movements had changed, He no longer carried the same certainty he once relied on. Instead, he acted with sharp alertness, as though he knew control had weakened and that any small disruption could cascade into a larger collapse he would be blamed for. The child's fate became the subject of hushed speculation. Some workers believed they had been taken away the night of the confrontation, removed before dawn by unseen hands, and spirited to another property where questions could not follow. Others insisted the child had survived, but gone into hiding somewhere within the estate, protected by an elder worker who refused to reveal their location. A different group whispered that the child had slipped away during the confusion and made it beyond the property line, vanishing into the thick forests that bordered the estate, an escape few believed was realistically possible, but secretly hoped for nonetheless. No evidence surfaced to confirm any version, yet the uncertainty itself gained a strange power. The absence of the child became a space into which people poured their own hopes, fears, and interpretations of the night's events. Without a clear ending, the child became more than a servant. They became a symbol whose meaning shifted depending on who whispered the story. Inside the main house, the aftermath played out differently. Mrs. Landry worked tirelessly to reimpose structure, drafting new rules that controlled worker movement, restricted access to certain areas, and tightened surveillance of activities that had once been routine. Visitors were reduced to only the most trusted allies. Unannounced inspections became common, conducted under the pretense of maintaining order, but clearly meant to identify any lingering threat tied to the senator's secret. The atmosphere inside the house grew tense in a way that even longtime domestic staff found unsettling. Rooms felt colder, hallways longer, and the presence of political aides increasingly intrusive. Some aides stayed for days, attempting to locate remaining evidence or suppress rumors spreading across the parish. Others returned to the capital, carrying fragments of information they filtered selectively, depending on whose ear they needed to protect. The workers who remained moved through this environment with heightened caution. They had seen enough to understand that truth now lived in a dangerous gray area, too clear to ignore, too costly to acknowledge. Whispers circulated in kitchens, behind barns, near water pumps, and in the half-lit corners of sleeping quarters. People discussed the confrontation in fragmented pieces, someone claiming they heard a crash inside the restricted room, someone else claiming they saw the senator stumbling down the hall afterward, another insisting they had witnessed aides burning piles of paper late into the night. These stories grew, merged, contradicted each other, and reshaped themselves repeatedly, but always returned to the central mystery of what the child had carried into that room and why the senator had reacted with such visible desperation. Workers debated quietly whether the truth had been worth the suffering that followed. Some argued that secrets held by powerful men never benefited those beneath them, and exposing them only shifted danger downward. Others believed the moment had broken something necessary, the illusion that the senator's influence was untouchable, and that even small fractures could matter in the long span of history. But fear remained the overriding sentiment, because the punishment delivered during the confrontation, however concealed from explicit detail, had left a deep mark. The community understood that efforts to reveal truth carried consequences not only for the individual who acted, but for everyone forced to live in the shadow of that choice. Despite attempts to suppress the story, information began slipping beyond the estate. A traveling worker mentioned overhearing a conversation while passing through the region, hinting that something had gone wrong on the Landry property. A field hand visiting a supply station recognized one of the aides from the senator's office, looking shaken and guarded, speaking of internal matters and temporary instability. Rumors crossed parish lines, reaching households with their own troubled histories involving political figures. The more people retold the story, the more it transformed, acquiring elements that were less literal and more symbolic. An unnamed worker standing up to corruption, a child uncovering a buried truth, a powerful man losing control during a stormy night. Each retelling bent details to fit the storyteller's perspective, but all versions preserved the core tension. Someone small had challenged someone immensely powerful, and the community had felt the impact. Over time, physical remnants of the secret circulated quietly. A copy of a forged signature appeared in another household, carried by someone who claimed it had been saved before the aides destroyed the originals. A scrap of correspondence, one that did not directly state wrongdoing but hinted strongly at mismanagement, was folded and hidden inside a tobacco tin passed between trusted workers. A ledger with missing pages surfaced months later in a town 12 miles away, its gaps interpreted by locals as evidence of political deception. None of these items alone could condemn a senator, but together they formed a network of quiet testimony preserved by individuals who understood the value of memory when institutions refused to record uncomfortable truths. The child's choice, whether deliberate or born of desperation, left a legacy that extended far beyond their own fate. For some, the child became a cautionary figure, a reminder of the price paid for knowing too much. For others, the child represented resistance in its most vulnerable form, the kind of action that history often overlooks yet depends upon to force future reckoning. Workers told their children stories about the night when fear shifted, not vanished, but changed direction, proving that even the most powerful men lived with vulnerabilities they tried to bury beneath wealth, land, and influence. These stories circulated far beyond the estate, crossing community boundaries and surviving in forms that blended fact with interpretation. The child, whether alive or not, no longer existed solely within the confines of one property. They became part of the region's oral history, a figure reshaped through repetition into something larger than any single life. In quiet households, older workers reflected privately on the moral weight of that night. They asked themselves whether the truth, once uncovered, could be considered justice when the cost fell so heavily on those who had no protection. They wondered whether silence had ever truly offered safety, or whether it merely delayed the harm. They questioned who benefited when truth remained hidden and who suffered when it surfaced. These reflections were not written down in journals or recorded in official ledgers, but they lived in the small decisions people made afterward, who they warned, what they avoided, how they interpreted the dangers around them. The moral tension remained unresolved, because no answer could cleanly reconcile the competing needs of survival and integrity. The estate itself changed slowly but noticeably as weeks turned into months. The fields continued to yield crops, the schedules remained strict, and the social hierarchy remained intact, but something essential had shifted beneath the structure. Workers behaved differently, not rebelliously, but with a quiet resilience that had not existed before. Eyes now watched the movements of powerful people with sharper awareness. Conversations carried an undercurrent of caution, but also of connection, a shared understanding that the night of the confrontation had revealed truths about the estate's internal power that could no longer be ignored. Even Benton, who prided himself on imposing order, sensed that the foundation had weakened. He enforced rules more aggressively, but also more anxiously, aware that fear alone no longer guaranteed compliance. Senator Thorne's public image suffered small fractures almost immediately. Nothing catastrophic occurred, but subtle signs appeared, hesitations in his public statements, shifts in the confidence of his political allies, and an increased need for appearances that projected control. Newspapers published vague references to internal disputes, though never naming the estate directly. Political opponents whispered about mismanaged funds, careful not to push too hard without evidence, but eager to capitalize on any perceived weakness. The senator's influence remained strong, but it no longer felt absolute. The night of the confrontation lingered at the edges of his reputation, an unspoken shadow that followed him into meetings, hearings, and conversations with colleagues who sensed something had changed. As for the child, their presence persisted through memory even when their physical existence remained uncertain. Workers spoke about them with a kind of careful reverence, not idolizing them, but acknowledging the courage required to carry the weight of what they had witnessed. The child became a figure invoked during quiet moments, a reminder that even those with the least power could disturb the structures built to contain them. Whether the child had survived, escaped, or been hidden by someone sympathetic mattered less over time than the fact that their decision had forced a powerful man to confront the truth he tried to bury. The story of that night continued to circulate, not as a single narrative, but as many variations shaped by the community's experiences. Each version carried the same core question: what does justice require when revealing the truth endangers the innocent? Families debated the question quietly, using examples from their own histories and from the child's story. Some argued that justice meant exposing wrongdoing regardless of consequences, believing that silence only strengthened those who misuse power. Others insisted that survival must take precedence, that truth held no value if the people who lived it were destroyed in the process. No consensus formed because the question itself resisted closure. It demanded that each person confront the tension between moral responsibility and self-preservation, between hope for change and the immediate need to protect those closest to them. In the end, the legacy of the child's choice became woven into the region's understanding of its own past. The story survived not because institutions recorded it, but because ordinary people carried it forward. They passed it down with caution, adjusting details to protect the living, shaping the narrative so it revealed danger without inviting retaliation. It became part of the hidden history shared in kitchens, porches, and fields, a history that rarely entered official archives but influenced the way individuals viewed power, truth, and the cost of confronting injustice. The estate continued its operations, the senator continued his career, and the workers continued their labor, but the memory of the confrontation lingered like an echo that refused to fade entirely. The narrative closes not with a clear resolution, but with an enduring question, the same one that defined the child's final act. When exposing the truth endangers the innocent, what does justice truly require? It is a question that offers no simple answer, because history itself rarely provides one. Instead, it leaves us to consider how decisions made in moments of fear or courage ripple outward, shaping communities, influencing memory, and revealing the fragile boundaries between power and accountability. The story asks the audience to reflect on how injustice survives through silence, how truth survives through risk, and how the smallest actions, undertaken by those with the least protection, can expose the hidden foundations of power. In this way, the child's legacy becomes not a single event, but an ongoing reminder of the moral weight carried by those forced to navigate a world where truth is dangerous, justice is uncertain, and survival often depends on decisions made in the shadows.